This time would be different. This time, Lucius Cornelius Sulla had a plan. Frustrated by the rapid reversal of the laws he had carried through under the threat of armed force during his first stint at the top of Roman politics in 88, Sulla had returned from his military campaign in the east to win a civil war and seize the state for himself in 82. Now he would aspire not to the position of consul, the typical chief magistrate of Rome, but instead would become the first dictator in over 100 years, and embark on a plan to remake Rome by rapidly fracturing resistance to his reactionary political program. For Sulla had come to believe that Rome was too far gone to be saved by constitutional means, that pesky details such as citizens' rights to have a say in who their leaders were, to have fair trials, and to be protected by their tribunician representatives were standing in the way of his plan to reforge the Roman state to more resemble what he believed had been the foundation of its past successes. According to Sulla, Rome would be great again, even if thousands of people had to die and its most cherished traditions had to be discarded to achieve his vision. Sulla's first taste of absolute power in 88 had seen him disregard constitutional norms to massacre political opponents, but the setbacks his party faced in the intervening years and the inevitable violent counter-reaction from his foes had convinced Sulla that, if anything, he had been too lenient. Now, with his dominance of the state assured and unchallenged, Sulla resolved to cut a bloody swath through Rome as he aimed to permanently cripple the popular Marian party that had opposed his agenda. But Sulla knew better than to simply announce that he would be dismantling Roman civic protections and rights in one fell swoop. Instead, he resolved to break the opposition to his unprecedented power grab piece, by dividing and conquering, assuring senators and the public alike that they had nothing to fear. It was only the unsavory troublemakers he was after. Never mind that his definition of a troublemaker continued to expand. Understanding the radical and potentially unpopular nature of his program, Sulla chose as his first victims those who he believed no Roman would ever defend. The Samnites, an Italian people with a distinct language and culture that had only recently been folded into the fabric of the Republic with citizenship rights. The Samnites made for the perfect trial balloon because of their long history of enmity with the Republic. Between 343 and 290 BCE, 3 wars had been fought between Rome and confederations of Samnite cities. Despite many setbacks, the conflicts ended in victory for the legions, and with Samnium being absorbed into Rome's alliance system, though abuses and questions of citizenship rights led to the Samnites joining the Italian revolt of the Social War in 91. This rebellion was in many ways the first Roman civil war, and it allowed Sulla to rise to prominence as the most able Roman commander of his generation. Though the Republic was able to claim victory as the uprising fizzled out by 88, Rome had brought the rebels back to the table by granting many of the civic rights that they had demanded, and the Samnites were among those that received Roman citizenship. In the political upheavals of the following years, however, the Samnite communities had aligned behind the Marian faction that promised greater privileges and protection for non-Latin Italians, meaning that they were among the most fervent supporters of the Populari regime that Sulla sought to overthrow. They made up a significant portion of the forces that Sulla defeated at the Battle of the Colline Gate. Sulla had won many Roman and Italian elites over to his side during the Civil War by playing the part of the cool, level-headed pragmatist. But now that victory was assured, he unveiled his true plans and ordered the execution of over 3,000 prisoners of Samnite origin in a brutal display charged with overt political symbolism. As he had issued orders to make no prisoners, many of them were cut to pieces on the field, while the remainder, said to be about 3,000 or 4,000 men, who threw down their arms, were led off to the Villa Publica in the Campus Martius, and there shut in. 3 days after, soldiers were sent in, who massacred the whole. And when Sulla drew up his conscription list, he did not rest satisfied until he had destroyed, or driven from Italy, everyone who bore a Samnite name. To those who reproached him for his animosity, he replied that he had learned by experience that not a single Roman could rest in peace so long as any of the Samnites survived. Thus their cities have now dwindled into villages. It is hard to imagine the scale of the slaughter, or how long and drawn out such a horrific event must have been in the ancient world, but we cannot overlook that Sulla had ordered the deaths of men with citizenship rights, and that they were executed between 1 to 3 days after the conclusion of the battle, depending on the sources we follow. No case can be made that they presented a military danger, and ancient practice in similar circumstances was to execute leaders only, while sparing the rank and file. Furthermore, the setting of the massacre was also noteworthy, as this all occurred within a sacred building where Roman ambassadors typically received foreign emissaries. It was a building literally founded on the good faith and honesty of the Roman people, and the prisoners must surely have felt that this was the safest place in the city. Sulla's barbarism was an indicator that his word was now the law, and it was subject to change whenever he saw fit. The opposition to Sulla's actions here isn't mere modern squeamishness on my part. Ancient sources were reviled by this as well. However, the end of the fighting was not also the end of the killing, for even after peace was made, swords were drawn, and punishment was inflicted upon those who had surrendered voluntarily. The slaughter of more than 70,000 men by Sulla at Sacriportus and the Colline Gate was a lesser crime, for it was what one expects in war. But he ordered 4,000 unarmed citizens who had been surrendered to be slain in the Villa Publica. Do not all these 4,000 slain in peace really outnumber those other 70,000? Though the exact timeline is murky, we are told of yet another Samnite massacre, this one even more chilling, as it was designed to intimidate the Senate and any Marian sympathizers left in the city. Sulla summoned the Senate to a meeting outside the Pomerium where he would demonstrate just how dramatically the balance of power had shifted, and reveal more of his murderous plans. When, therefore, Sulla learned this, and also that the greater part of the enemy had been destroyed, he came to Antemne at break of day. There, 3,000 of the inhabitants sent a deputation to him to sue for mercy, and he promised them safety if they would do some mischief to the rest of his enemies before coming to him. So they, trusting to his promise, attacked the rest of the people in the city, and many more were slain by one another's hands. However, the survivors of both parties alike, to the number of 6,000, were collected by Sulla in the circus at Rome, and then the Senate was summoned to him to meet in the temple of Bellona. And at one and the same moment he himself began to speak in the Senate, and those assigned to the task began to cut to pieces the 6,000 in the circus. The shrieks of such a multitude, who were being massacred in a narrow space, filled the air, of course, and the senators were dumbfounded. But Sulla, with the calm and unmoved countenance with which he had begun to speak, ordered them to listen to his words and not concern themselves with what was going on outside, for it was only that some criminals were being admonished by his orders. This gave even the dullest Roman to understand that, in the matter of tyranny, there had been an exchange, but not a deliverance. Like the massacre at the Villa Publica, this too was a calculated gesture. We can only imagine the blood-curdling screams and howls of anguish emanating from the 6,000 victims as they were methodically butchered. This slaughter was no small undertaking, and Sulla was demonstrating to the Senate that he had hundreds, if not thousands, of loyal soldiers, willing to follow any command he gave. It must have been absolutely horrifying to listen to, and Sulla was sending a message that any senator who opposed his regime could expect a similar fate. However, ultimately, he received the legal fig leaf for his brutal purges through popular edict, either circumventing the Senate because they did not accede quickly enough, or as a further effort to demonstrate how impotent the body now was. The man who claimed to be fighting to restore the primacy and authority of the Senate here denied that it had any authority over him. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. Having sentenced thousands to death already, and observing no significant mobilization against him, Sulla then set his eyes on eliminating those that were closer to the heart of Roman power: senators, equestrians, and popular activists. The inability to demonstrate solidarity with Sulla's carefully selected enemies, or to think in truly radical terms, was the downfall of the Senate, and spelled doom for many of its members, as well as the other Romans now on the chopping block. These elites either did not know what was in store, or they thought by keeping their heads down they could evade Sulla's wrath. Cowed completely, Sulla's unprecedented position as a dictator with no limit on his time in office was legitimized, and he would now claim a mandate to reform the state using the extraordinary powers he had granted himself. Critically, this now included the ability to mark any citizen for death without trial. While his initial abuses had been against those from Italian communities with linguistic or cultural differences that made them outsiders to the Romans, and that had only recently gained protections, the incoming political purges were directed against those who were definitively and unambiguously Roman. But Sulla would not bloody his own hands with the deaths of these citizens. Instead, lists of individuals were posted in the forum, denoting those who were now no longer protected by the law. Potential assassins were promised a reward if they brought back his head, and the estate of the proscribed was then auctioned off. Furthermore, Sulla ensured legal protections for those who carried out his unofficial purges, decreeing that the death squads could not be prosecuted, and ensuring that no one would ever be able to bring charges by removing civic rights from the descendants of all the proscribed. Though the Latin term proscrire, translated as proscription, now unambiguously refers to the kill lists that Sulla and other Roman tyrants posted, it was originally most commonly associated with notices of a public auction where property could be sold to the highest bidder. This is notably what happened to the property of the condemned, so the use of this specific word underscores how devious Sulla's plot was. He was simply alerting the public that there would be an auction for a man's property, and that it would be fully legal to hunt him down and kill him to accelerate this. The mechanisms were entirely implicit, illustrating just how much thought and effort to cloak the murders under the law went into the proscriptions. These were not mere acts of impulsive retribution, but rather a deliberate and carefully constructed framework for political terror that relied on legal fictions and plausible deniability. Sulla also outplayed the Senate by gradually adding names to the lists with each passing day. Initially, it only included 80 names, all prominent members of the Marian faction. He knew that were he to name all those whose deaths he sought, then they might be able to combine their wealth, clientship bases, and political connections to resist his regime. Instead, he started with the most extreme, and the list grew in a piecemeal fashion. 2 days after the first list, another was posted containing 220 names. The following day, 220 additional names were added. So, senators and equestrians who were too afraid to stick up for colleagues and friends on day one found themselves added to the list later. Who knows how history may have turned out differently had more Romans recognized that the purges would not end with the Marian party, but would encompass all whom Sulla desired to destroy. For it would go beyond merely political opponents to include any man whose wealth Sulla or another in his inner circle coveted. Cicero's first prominent case involved the defense of a man whose father had been added to the list, simply so an associate of Sulla could buy his property at a steep discount. All told, thousands of Roman citizens would die at the hands of Sulla's executioners, some for their political affiliations, but many simply so that wealth could be consolidated and distributed by Sulla to his supporters to ensure loyalty to his unprecedented dictatorship. But we also must recognize that those caught up in the proscriptions were not the first to die. Sulla's tyrannical reign began in bloodshed, specifically targeted at outsiders within the Roman Republic, for whom the average Roman may have felt long-standing prejudices, or perhaps even personal enmity. Soon, those who had cheered the deaths of others, or who had maybe just stood silently by, found that Sulla had not been completely forthright in his ambitions, and that trusting a man with no scruples or principles beyond his own vengeful quest for dominance was a mistake. We would do well to remember that those who target civil rights and freedoms often do so by starting with edge cases and those that have been otherized, hoping that there will be less sympathy for those that are subversive or viewed as not truly part of the national community. But it doesn't stop there. It never has, and it never will. Keeping your head down is not a winning strategy. Two men would defy Sulla's prescriptions, each in radically different ways. The renegade general Quintus Sertorius, perhaps the most militarily capable of the Marians, set up a republic in exile in Spain, attracting many Marian partisans to his cause, and forging an alliance with the local population that allowed his breakaway state to persist even after the death of Sulla, even defeating Pompey in the process. He was assassinated after nearly a decade as the leader of what he considered to be the true republic, and his embryonic state collapsed soon after. This was the resistance that surely occupied most of Sulla's thoughts. But it was another who would end up doing the most to destroy Sulla's legacy. A seemingly unimportant young noble named Gaius Julius Caesar had been added to the proscription lists for his refusal to divorce the daughter of a prominent Marian leader, revealing the resolve that would later catapult him to the top of Roman politics. Caesar made it clear that no man would dictate to him how he was to treat his own wife, even if it meant making an enemy of the most powerful man in Rome. For weeks, Caesar lived as a fugitive until family connections were able to secure a pardon. Everyone knows that when Sulla had long held out against the most devoted and eminent men of his party who interceded for Caesar, and they obstinately persisted, he at last gave way and cried, either by divine inspiration or a shrewd forecast, "Have your way and take him, only bear in mind that the man you are so eager to save will one day deal the death blow to the cause of the aristocracy, which you have joined with me in upholding. For in this Caesar there is more than one Marius." Sulla was right. In the years after the dictator's death, Caesar would make his connection to Marius and his defiance of the unpopular Sulla the linchpin of his public persona as he rose to prominence in Rome, with the Populare party searching for a standard-bearer after losing so many leading men during the proscriptions. Caesar was quickly able to emerge as a political force by trumpeting his consistent opposition to Sulla and his hated regime. Soon, Caesar and his allies would leverage popular anger to dismantle all the legal reforms Sulla had forced through at sword point. Sulla's overreach had made everything he feared inevitable. There are many ways to resist. and it doesn't matter which one you choose, so long as you choose one.